Good morning, everyone. Who's feeling reasonably awake right now? It's maybe a 1 to 2 split that we've got, so 66% of you maybe need more sleep. I don't know what's going on there. But I've got a couple of wee mission updates, as my dad said. So from April onwards, I'm going to be pretty scarce. So some of you might remember that last summer I was helping a Christian pop punk band that was doing evangelism all over the place. And as part of their show, they've got a bunch of theatrical stuff and a storyline through the whole thing, and they need actors for that, so they've asked me to be one of the actors, so I'm going to be doing that. So that will take up a decent chunk of time, and then besides that, I'll also be volunteering at the mission school that I went to last year, so that will also be a decent commitment, so that will run through to September-ish, and then November there will be another tour, and who knows how else I'll fill my time. I've got folks in the Netherlands who've said if you want to join what we're doing here, you could do that, so we'll see. But that's kind of where I'm at right now, and what's next. So, yeah, that's all the wee mission updates. So, today I'm going to be speaking on 1 Kings 19, and this is all about the story where Elijah has just killed all the prophets of Baal with the sword, which I think is quite an overlooked detail in this story, because that's pretty intense. And then he goes and runs off to the wilderness because he gets death threats, and that's quite scary. So, and I'm going to be speaking specifically about 3 ways that God meets us. This is not a definitive list, but just some ways that are helpful and that I see in this story. And to give you a brief overview to start us off, the 3 ways are, first off, God meets us practically. God meets us in quiet and in stillness, and God meets us in our imperfect perspectives. I couldn't find like a great way to word that last one, so you have to wait to the end to figure out what I mean by that. But let's just start this off and get right into the text. So, now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." So this is an intense start to the story, and I'm not sure if anyone here has ever had a messenger coming to their door on behalf of someone else to say, "I will kill you." Anybody had that experience? No, but I can imagine that that'd be very scary. And his response is just very natural and human. He just runs. So let's keep reading. So Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, while he himself went on a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a broom bush, sat under it, and prayed that he might die. "I have had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. All at once, an angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." He looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank and then lay down again. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." So he got up and ate and drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and spent the night. So this is where I'd like to get into the first way that God meets us, and that is that he meets us practically. I love how in this passage, the angel is almost like a grandma. Elijah wakes up from his nap, eats food, goes back to sleep, and the angel's like, no, eat more food. Like, so I love that we know of falling asleep and eating more. And then I also find it quite interesting because God could have used a miracle to sustain him, but he chooses to use something very practical to meet his immediate needs in that moment, and I think that's quite important. And this is more than a month before he meets his spiritual needs, so already he's meeting his practical needs first and later the spiritual ones, and I think that shows that that very much matters to God and that that's very important. And one of Andrew's favorite words right now is the word heresy, and I'm not entirely convinced he knows what it means. But the idea that the spiritual world is more important than the practical world is a heresy, because both are very important to God. And one of my friends recently was telling me that one day before work he felt God saying to him, bring jam with you. He was like, okay, that's a bit weird, but I'll do it. So his work provides his lunch every day, and on this particular occasion, all his work had was bread. So then he remembered, like, right, God told me to bring jam, so here we are. So things like that matter to God, and in the Lord's Prayer, Jesus puts directly after, establish your kingdom on earth, give us bread. So this stuff very much matters, and you guys might be thinking, were you hungry while writing this part of your sermon? And that would be correct. But I think the point still stands that the practical, real-world things matter to God, and he meets us in practical ways, and let's make sure to notice them and be thankful for them and not be scared to ask for him to meet those things too. And I know I've talked a lot about food, but obviously that includes way more, and there'll be all sorts of adult practical things that I don't understand living in my parents' house right now and that sort of stuff. So, right, let's keep reading the text. So the word of the Lord came to him. What are you doing here, Elijah? He replied, I've been very zealous for the Lord Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too. The Lord said, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Then a great, powerful wind tore the mountain apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. So here's the next way that I would like to point out that God meets us, and that is in quiet and stillness and in peace. We see all of these theatrics that go before God, but when he actually shows up, it's very quietly and gently. And obviously, God shows up often in ways that completely grab our attention and that we can't miss, and that does happen. But often, he chooses to wait until we quiet ourselves and shows up in ways that we wouldn't notice if we were distracted by something else or not really intentionally being unhurried. And I know that's not quite what's happening in this passage, because Elijah's not quieting himself. What's happening is God is making a bunch of noise, and then he quiets down. But we do see that he chooses to go to a place where it'll be just him and God, so that he's the only other person around. He leaves his servant behind, so it's just him and God, and so we can pay attention to that. And we also see Jesus set an example of doing this in Luke 15:16, it says, "But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed." And we live in a world where there's so much noise that it's often hard to pay attention to the physical world, never mind the spiritual one. And we need to learn to create spaces where there's not noise and distraction and hurry. And this can look different for every one of us. And I'm sure some of you guys have had quiet time habits locked down for years now, but there's different ways of doing it. And I find for me, often I'll be like on the bus to Edinburgh, and that's like an hour. And that can be unhurried time with God, or being in a coffee shop or whatever. There's all sorts of different ways of doing it. And I think even if we carved out 5 to 10 minutes of unhurried time with God in a day, you would notice the impact that makes in your day and in your life. I remember there was one day where I was feeling quite angsty, and I just reflected on a verse to keep my Bible app streak up or whatever it was. And I spent maybe, I don't know, a minute on it, and I noticed half an hour later, my mood had completely shifted, and I didn't notice in the moment, but there was a change from choosing to read a verse just a few times and give God that space. Right, let's keep reading this text. So, then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "I have been very zealous for the Lord Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant and torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." The Lord said to him, "Go back the way you came and go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint," gosh, I've not tried to read this name yet, "Hazael king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king over Israel. And anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat from Abel Meloha, to succeed you as prophet. Jehu will put to death any who escape the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death any who escape the sword of Jehu. Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and whose mouths have not kissed him." So the final place I want to point out where God meets us is in our imperfect perspectives. God doesn't say to Elijah, "Have more faith." Instead, he gives him instructions to refocus him on what he's called to do, and he gives him truth that counters the negativity in his perspective and that he's experiencing. And often it's easy for us to get focused on what's wrong with the world, and we have quite literally access to all the bad news in the world if you so desire it. And I'm not saying block out all bad news ever, because we live in the real world, but also we can't be paying attention to all of it, and we simply don't have the capacity to think about all the problems that exist. And God has a calling for all of us, and a way that we can impact the world around us, and something that we can focus on, and a next thing to do. And among the many problems in the world, there are things that God has appointed you guys to do. So we need to be focused on that. And also God corrects his perspective with the truth, that his perspective is simply wrong. And he's not the only one following God. There's actually 7,000 people in Israel still who were worshipping God at this point, and he thought he was it. And well, in the Western world, it can often seem like whole nations are abandoning their faith. The church is growing more than ever in places like China and Iraq. And all over the UK, there are people quietly, faithfully serving God who we will never know about. On Friday, some of us were at a Rend Collective concert and we saw people flood into this 3,000 capacity venue to come and celebrate and worship God. Raise your hand if you were there. I know a decent amount of people were. So, Alan said it was his first concert since like 90 something or whatever. So, well done. And so while God meets him in his imperfect perspective, he changes his perspective, and this happened when Elijah was able to put what he was thinking and how he saw things before God, and that had to happen first. And we see this all over the Psalms where people bring their negative and imperfect perspectives before God. And then we see God turn their perspectives around. In Psalm 10:1 it says, "Why, Lord, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble?" And the second last verse says, "You, Lord, hear the desire of the afflicted. You encourage them and you listen to their cry." And we see this pattern all over Scripture of people bringing their negativity and poor perspectives to God and him changing that around. And often I'll be reading Psalms and I'll be like, I'm not sure I'd be comfortable reading this in church necessarily, but the Bible is quite raw when it comes to bringing how we feel before God, and he won't let you stay in that place forever, but he does want you to be able to express that and bring that to him. And I also think that everyone here has probably, or most of you guys have probably seen God answer us and give us direction and focus at certain points, and we can also look back on those and get perspective from that. And I'm sure Elijah was reflecting on these words that God spoke to him for the rest of his ministry, and that was part of what kept him focused and going. So let's not be scared to tell God how we're feeling and how we see things, and let's also be open to letting him change our perspectives. So obviously there are plenty of other ways that God can meet us and change us, but I think these ones are especially helpful to keep in mind for day-to-day life. And in summary, God meets us practically in the real world where we're at. He meets us in stillness and in quiet and when we choose to calm ourselves. And he meets us when we bring our imperfect perspectives before him. So there you go. And a wee reminder about youth, as we have a youth meeting for all the, I think primary, if you're out of primary school, then you are very welcome. We have pizza and we're going to have a great conversation with the amazing list of questions that Siobhan has come up with and all sorts of stuff. So you should come. And yeah.